I think plagued by guilt is a pretty good way of describing the way that I experience reality on a day-to-day basis. Like, I think I've talked a little bit about the idea of the original sin and how I feel a sense of original sin simply for existing all the time. But that's not necessarily what I want to talk about in this video. Not a inherent sense of being less than other people and whatnot. More about things that I've actually done because it's interesting. I've assumed in the past that I'm unable to feel guilty or that I don't feel guilty simply because I'm able to cope with feeling guilty. But those things are not the same thing. Um, and I think there was a time, a very short time. This arc never lasted long, but there was a time when I wanted to believe I was a sociopath to the extent of making myself believe it. Because to live in the world with guilt, a spirit, the ability to feel things is it's horrible. It can feel really horrible. And so the alternative of not caring at all and being, not driven by emotion, just being entirely vindicative and logical, seemed like a really appealing option because I wouldn't be, overblown by all of the emotions that I had. The side effect of this was, of course, that it broke down, as any facade does. It inevitably breaks down, and I ended up having to explain to everyone over, over the period of like why over the period of 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever I had been going on and on about how I was a sociopath, turned out to not be true. Now, it isn't as if there aren't certain tendencies within that personality cluster that I relate to, but there's probably certain tendencies within every cluster that people relate to. So it's not a very good indicator of who you are. Um, so there are certain ways in which I experience guilt different from other people, certain things that I don't feel guilty over that other people might. But also, the kind of things that I don't feel guilty over are things that I think are actually pretty common when you think of most people. They were just emphasized to me by my parents as something you should feel bad about. So, like, for example, like taking other people's food, for example. That's something that I try not to do because in my head, logically, I can discern that it's wrong. There's a conscience in the back of my brain that says you shouldn't do that because the other person would feel bad. And so, most of the time, I don't take other people's food. But there have been instances in which I did, and I felt bad for it. And there have been instances in which I did where I just didn't feel anything. It wasn't like I went about my day regularly, it was more like there was a certain numbness to everything that I did. I didn't feel bad overtly, but I did feel different. Um, I can't really place or name a time in which it just absolutely didn't do anything. I didn't notice any effect whatsoever, maybe like one or two, but in general, it had some kind of effect. And I always thought, because the effect is not more overt, because I'm not experiencing this in a more direct way, that there's something wrong with me. That there's something wrong with me because I don't feel more bad about this. And ultimately, I think what that was a result of was just conditioning from my parents, that like there were things that were heavily emphasized to me, either with violence or yelling, screaming, these kind of things at a very young age, that you should feel bad. You should feel bad about doing these things. And that was just ingrained into my brain. And there are things now that I look back on from years and years ago, that as soon as I get the memory, as soon as I remember it, I feel really guilty. I feel terrible. For example, I was just thinking of this review of a friend's game that I had. A friend of mine who was a video game developer, or who is, I no longer talk to him anymore, unrelated to this problem, we just don't speak to one another. Um, I wrote a review of his video game, and in the beginning, the first paragraph like really rails on the art style in the game, which seemed to be the thing that everyone liked about it. I seemed to be the only one who really didn't like the aesthetic of the game. And I was using pretty colorful wording to describe how much I did not like the art, which seemed, it was mean. It was mean the way that I wrote that, but it was meant to be kind of comedic. Like it was meant to be it was meant to be in the spirit of just fun writing, because I see writing as like a medium of art where where the expression of writing, how the thing is being said, to me is more interesting than what's being said. And so I wanted that first paragraph to act as a sort of bridge for the rest of the story, quote unquote, which would be the review of the game. And every word I wanted to have a sort of flow with one another, each paragraph flowing into one another, and for all of them to progressively elevate your feelings in the way that a story would, in the way that the progression of a story would, with the rhythm of the words connecting to one another. And part of that is being able to elevate people's senses through colorful imagery, which can sometimes be more negative in how it's worded than it actually is, because of the inherently exaggerated nature of how writing works, Everything is a character in that way. And I was told by the friend of that friend that review needed to be toned down because it would upset him. And that friend knew that other person really, really well. This is going to upset them. I didn't listen, and I released the review as it was onto the internet. And that was that. The guy's response to the script when I sent it to him was, "Aw, nice script." And he said this like a few minutes after I sent it to him. Like it was absurdly fast, like fast. No one can read that fast, I was thinking in my head as he responded. And it made me think he just read the first two paragraphs and then had to quit. He just felt too bad when reading it. And it made me really upset because I thought I did something gravely wrong. I thought I made a grave mistake with what I had wrote, that the other friend was right. And I had messaged him saying look, this is like a character, I wasn't trying to be mean, I'm sorry. And he said, no, really, it's fine. And he was backpedaling on it, like he was trying really hard to emphasize that he was okay, which only in turn made me feel like there was something that he wasn't saying, that he was scooting around the issue, because that was always the general sense that I got from this person, that they're the kind of person who doesn't like conflict, who likes to avoid conflict, and as a result will scoot around the issue in order to make it appear less serious than it is, so they can just move on to something else. And perhaps my characterization of them is wrong, but what if it wasn't? What if I was entirely right in my instincts? And generally I'm pretty good at reading people and being able to tell what their motivations are, or just reading the room of like, this is why the person feels this way. Like it seems like time and time again, the predictions that I have with people end up turning out to be right. Of course, I don't act on them premeditatively, is that the word? Prematurely? But I don't act on them too early. There was a specific word that I wanted to use that would have expressed that better, but I can't remember what it is at this time. I don't ever act on instinct, because instinct has to have evidence. most things that you do, or really everything you do in regards to other people, has to have evidence before you do it, or else it's unjustified. Because what if the thing that I do accidentally hurts the other person? And that is a very grave thing. That's a horrible thing to do. Even if it's just hurting them in a small way, the fact that you're bringing pain into someone else's life at all is a bad thing. And so I try as hard as I possibly can to never act on instincts, because my instinct could turn out to be wrong. And even though my instincts are generally correct, I will never act on them in regards to other people. I will never, ghost somebody or say something that doesn't have evidence behind it to someone without confidence that that thing is justified. And you need evidence in order to justify that, or else you're potentially throwing a bomb at someone who doesn't deserve it, in the metaphorical sense, because you don't have evidence to justify the conclusions of those instincts. And so it's a very dangerous thing to be proven, to be proven right at your base feeling enough times, because eventually that can turn into a feedback loop of like, I I'm going to make my instincts be correct, subconsciously. I'm going to make them correct with my own actions, and then turn around and then justify them by saying I was right the whole time, which is really dangerous. Of course, that's on the extreme end of what I'm talking about, but in general, you shouldn't act without evidence in regards to other people. That's my philosophy. And it's to minimize the suffering of those other people, which is something that I'm constantly thinking about. I don't like I don't like harming anyone. My whole philosophy is centered around the idea that you should treat other people the way that you want to be treated. That's what I was always told as a kid. And what that means is not to treat people exactly the way you specifically would want to be treated. It's to treat people as if you can feel their pain, as if whatever scenario they're in, you can see yourself potentially in that scenario, and you're going to try to adjust your behavior to accommodate for them. And I don't mind doing that. Yeah, sure, there are certain quote-unquote freedoms that I have to give up as a result of doing that, but the pleasure that I get, or the sense of calmness, I guess peace that I get from doing that, is worth much more than whatever quote-unquote freedom I would have to be an audacious, loud, boisterous asshole. Things that obviously don't even remotely align with my personality. So guilt, as I refer to it in this video, is something that I'm constantly feeling. I can ignore it nowadays better than I used to be able to, but it is a continuous. It's always there, Like, I'll remember back to certain things that I've done, and I'll just keep feeling bad for it, and the guilt just never ends. It always just comes back, and I know there are psychological tactics that people have mentioned in self-help books in order to try and get over this, by like talking to chairs and stuff, or just outright erasing the memories through like medically mediated stuff. I haven't tried that one, but I've tried just speaking out the stuff, like what I'm doing right here, and usually it helps quite a bit. But in general, it's all a confusing mess. Maybe I'll make another video talking about original sin, because now that I've gotten all of this guilt stuff out, sort of the constant feeling and the things that go along with it, I feel like I could probably talk for an hour about the broader implications of just feeling guilty in general, because there is a lot that I can unpack with that, and the reasons for why I think could go to some interesting places.